If we wish to ascertain by way of non-biased interrogation whether the canonical Jesus, as in the Catholic and Protestant purported circa 1 to 30 Common Era Jesus character found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and Acts of the Apostles, is a historical character or a fictional character, we can approach the investigation by setting scenarios. And when doing this, the scenarios should be collectively exhaustive, such that they encompass all possible scenarios, thus ensuring that at least one of them will be true, and mutually exclusive, in that any one of the scenarios being true would ensure the remaining scenarios cannot be true. And we can achieve this with just two scenarios. Scenario A, the canonical Jesus is a historical person mythologized, or Scenario B, the canonical Jesus is a mythical demigod personified. These two scenarios intentionally omit the supernatural view of an actual son of a god, because it is not the intention of this production to offer analysis in this area. Abstract views of God originate from the minds of humans when our desire to understand our surroundings was in its infancy. The need for such entities to explain temporal events has diminished directly proportionally with our discoveries of what actually does cause such events. If you fervently believe in miracle conceptions, miracle births and miracle resurrections, this video is really not for you, since the video will only be offering observations on physical reality and does not recognise the concept that Iron Age fantasy fiction records actual physical events. Before we start the investigation, we need to establish the rationale behind the possibility of both scenarios. Many Christian apologists, William Lane Craig being the most prominent and vocal today, forward arguments stating that the ideas of a mythical Christ, which they claim emanate from the 18th century, have been fully debunked, and that the overwhelming scholarly consensus on the matter today is that the Jesus character did exist, and therefore the consensus supports Scenario A. Such protestations against the mythicist Scenario B position do need to be publicly challenged and corrected, because they are not correct. While some specific mythicist theories by some specific mythicists might have been proven baseless, the idea that the Jesus character could have been a myth personified as per Scenario B has most categorically not been shown to be baseless by the use of evidence which proves the canonical Jesus character definitely existed in history. At the time of producing this video, 2018, no such conclusive evidence in favour of Scenario A exists. All of this means, as of today, Scenario A and Scenario B are both available for further investigation. The scholarly consensus which supports Scenario A, that Craig refers to incessantly in his videos and lectures, mostly emanates from a time in our history when suggesting Scenario B would have been dangerous to one's well-being, and was therefore a view largely formulated under extreme duress. Also, it is a conclusion arrived at by looking at the extant documents of the Christian canon collectively as a whole, rather than individually and chronologically. For example, Paul's letters are interpreted by way of reference to the four canonical Gospels and Acts of the Apostles, but the Jesus story from the canonical Gospels did not exist when Paul wrote his letters, and Acts of the Apostles was written after the Gospels and after Paul's death. It is therefore a scholarly error to interpret Paul's meaning in his works by relating it to theological material found in documents that did not exist while Paul was alive. This investigation will therefore review the material from the relevant extant documents which form part of the New Testament canon in chronological order and in isolation of the material that exists in documents that succeed each of the documents. And this method will therefore reveal a chronological evolution of the Christ character. The chronology of the documents in the New Testament that are relevant to the question is: first, Paul's letters, dated by consensus to circa 50 to 57 Common Era, but I will be challenging those dates, only 7 of which are considered authentic. Then the four Gospels, first of which is Mark, post 70 Common Era, then Matthew and Luke, and last comes John, all of which tell the story of a Jesus character, Mark and John from the beginning of the character's ministry and up to his death, while Matthew and Luke start from the birth of the character and go up to his death, and then last comes Acts of the Apostles, which purports to tell the story of the Apostles, mainly Paul, after the death of the Jesus character. So first, in order of authorship, come the letters of an apocalyptic Christian preacher called Paul, believed to have been written between 50 and 57 Common Era. I will be significantly challenging these dates and the method by which these dates are ascertained. The documents are theological letters from Paul to Christian churches or members of a Christian church. And the most striking omission from these letters is any real concrete detail about a physical historical figure called Jesus that would have lived just 20 to 27 years before the writing of the letters. If the dates attributed to Paul's letters are correct, and the Jesus character did actually exist in history between circa 1 to 30 Common Era. There is no biography of a Jesus character within the structure of the 7 authenticated letters of Paul. And this is not a new revelation in this debate, it is quite well known and a well established fact. A more relevant fact, which is new to the debate and seems to be ignored by all scholars in this area from both sides of the argument, is that they are the words of one man at one particular time and one man only. It is entirely possible that the man in question wrote what he saw as the grounding of the Christian faith, and not one person of the time actually agreed with him. We do not possess any extant documents from the time frame concerned which would confirm Paul's words were actually accepted as authoritative and accurate. The scholarship around Paul's letters has always assumed that Paul's letters are the authority of the time, and that the letters do give an accurate reflection of the birth of Christianity and do faithfully represent the thoughts of all of the Christians of the age. The reality is, we have no means with which to confirm how Paul's rhetoric on Christianity was received by Christians in general at the time that Paul lived. We only have the words of Paul himself. So, to simply assume that Paul is the go-to reliable authority for information on the early days of Christology is a scholarly error. This production is going to present other possibilities that suggest the existence of several Christologies, both during and before Paul's time. Also questionable is the manner in which the term ecclesia is interpreted today each time Paul uses it in his letters. Today it is translated as church. So in 1 Thessalonians we have, to the church of the Thessalonians in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Reading this line with today's mindset of the noun church, one gets the sense that Paul talks of the church to Jesus in Thessalonica, as opposed to a church of Jesus in Thessalonica. The actual root meaning of ecclesia is simply meeting house or to congregate. This could be referring to a house where 2 or more people meet, and it could be a house where the people who worship Jesus as per Paul's rendition of Jesus meet. And for all we know, 2 doors down there might be a meeting place where people who worship Jesus as per Jim, Bob or George's rendition of Jesus meet. But our man Paul does not agree with other renditions of the Jesus theology, and is not concerned with other Jesus congregations, so he only writes to or about his own Jesus congregations, the Jesus worshippers who follow Paul's rendition. If this concept appears to be a little out there in terms of acceptability, think no further than Catholic versus Protestant today, and for the Protestants, all of the non-conformist Protestants. Then, all of the Eastern versions of Christology, Coptic Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, etc., and the list becomes quite extensive. In fact, can we identify a time in history when such diversity of interpretation did not exist? And with this in mind, why not in Paul's time? And before Paul's time also. The few items in the authenticated letters of Paul that could be considered references to the activities of a historical person called Jesus, who is said to have founded a religious movement, are very scant, and they give no indication as to locations or timeframes for the character. Scant though these references are, they are used within the post-70 Common Era canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and Acts of the Apostles, in order to fashion a larger narrative around them. In doing this, the Gospel writers create a very recent, within 40 years, 1 to 30 Common Era, historical person called Jesus, and a Jesus who founded a religious movement in the area of Galilee and Jerusalem. But the letters of Paul come first in chronology and precede the canonical Gospels by some 20 years, assuming the dates for Paul's letters are correct, and possibly much longer than 20 years if the dates are wrong, and this therefore only proves that the Gospel writers were aware of Paul and his letters. The Gospel writers could conceivably have used, as in plagiarized, some of the content of Paul's letters when writing their purported biographies of a Jesus character. Equally plausible at this juncture is the scenario A position that both Paul and the Gospel writers are referencing the same historical events, but Paul gives no timeline or location while the Gospel writers do. To understand the significance of this, we have to acknowledge that Paul does nothing more than evangelize about a demigod called Jesus, and in the exact same fashion as other soothsayers of the time evangelized about other demigods. There is nothing in Paul's letters that would allow us to confirm that his demigod is any different to any other demigod. Paul does claim his demigod walked the earth, but he does not say when or where. And Paul does claim his demigod was executed and resurrected, but again he does not say when or where or who was specifically responsible. So, without the knowledge of what the much later Catholic Gospels report, there is nothing within the letters of Paul to confirm that he and his fellow brethren, brothers and sisters in Christ, worshipped a man from very recent history. No time frame is indicated. Jesus to Paul and his followers could plausibly be, in their eyes, a metaphoric demigod from antiquity. One more telling conflicting inclusion in the works of Paul is Paul's comments on, or even complaints about, the preachers of different Jesus characters, and this is prime documented evidence which positively identifies multiple Christologies of a Jesus character purportedly circa 50 to 57 Common Era, but conceivably much earlier, in the area of the Middle East at the time that Paul preaches. Hence my earlier comments on the Jesus according to Paul, as opposed to the Jesus according to a Bob, Jim, George, etc., all of which have in churches and all claiming prominence, but only Paul's written communication surviving, by intentional preservation, through to the present day. I refer to the authentic letters of Paul because of all of the letters purporting to be from Paul in the New Testament canon, the scholarly consensus today is that only 7 of them are genuine, and these are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, 2 Corinthians and Romans. Next in history, post 70 Common Era, come the 4 canonical Gospels, which are viewed as biographies of a real Jesus of Nazareth who lived circa 1 to 30 Common Era. These are followed closely by a work called Acts of the Apostles, which picks up the story after Jesus dies and is a proposed biography of the Apostles' travels and deeds with a main focus on the Paul character. Now, there are 3 possible types of purported biographical works, being a true historical account of a real person, an actual biography, a part fictional, part factual account of a real person, an exaggerated biography, and a fictional story of a fictional person, a complete fiction. So we can put forward a case for interrogation to scrutinise which one of these 3 categories the canonical Gospels and Acts fit into. Prior to a thorough interrogation into these areas, and owing to the quantity of physically impossible supernatural events in the documents, only the last 2 propositions are possible, and the second proposition is the consensus. But we must be mindful that today's consensus of the part fictional, part factual account of a real person does not come about due to centuries of scholarship, but rather centuries of brutal enforcement. In fact, this enforcement was for the first possibility, a true historical account of a real person, but as scientific inquiry moved into the 19th and 20th centuries, the ideas of miracle conceptions, virgin births and coming back to life after being executed have been rejected in favour of the second option. Of the two positions that remain, both are feasible, but only one can be correct. It is the aim of this presentation to highlight that the latter of these two positions, the third proposition, is in fact plausible and the more probable by a considerably large margin, and that it should not be dismissed simply due to the weight and the vocal volume of the current consensus. The four Gospels can be fictional stories of a fictional character. It is only the chance outcome of past battles and the resulting brutal enforcement of belief onto our ancestors which leads many to believe today that the Jesus character did actually exist in history between 1 to 30 Common Era. We need to investigate whether we have been duped by the events of history and the Catholic Church's brutal control of the narrative over a 1,300 year period between circa 325 and the mid-1600s in order to properly analyse whether the consensus position today is justified or misguided. Given that Matthew and Luke follow Mark, and between them they repeat 96% of the Gospel of Mark, they are not, despite the claims of the theological scholars of today, independent attestations. They are merely plagiarised and enhanced copies of the same story, as is the final Gospel of John. We can hypothesize further that, if Paul only writes theological letters about a metaphorical demigod from antiquity, and the author of the Gospel of Mark wrote a purported biography about this demigod that other authors subsequently copied, Mark then becomes the only source document about the purported life of a Jesus character that we can use to determine between scenario A or scenario B. And of that document, we only have the copies that have been copied multiple times and changed many times available to us to review. We do not have the original. The earliest partial text of the Gospel of Mark that we possess is on Papyrus 45, which contains Mark chapters 4 to 9 and 11 to 12, and it is dated to circa 250, some 180 years after the original work would have been written. We know the Gospel of Mark is written after the Jewish Second Temple of Yahweh false Roman aggression, because it makes reference to the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem. This means the concept of the Jesus biography found in the four Gospels did not exist in written form until after 70 Common Era. Paul's letters to Christian churches, elements of which can be found in the four Gospels, are judged to have been written 15 to 20 years before the temple fell. But the method of obtaining these dates for Paul's letters is itself questionable. The time gap could be much larger, and they contain no indication of a biography or a belief in a very recent sage named Jesus. It is therefore a valid hypothesis that the fall of the temple might have been a pivotal event, an event that, for some Jews but not all, sparked the evolution of Abrahamic Jewish theological belief through to Catholic Christianity. An event that somehow created a desire, or maybe even a need, to morph Paul's probable mythical Jesus into a supposed historic Jesus in order to create a replacement theology to Temple Judaism. This surmised replacement theology would also sufficiently explain to shocked and bemused Jews why it was that Yahweh allowed the pagan Romans to destroy Jerusalem and its temple, and thus taking away what they perceived to be their only possible route to eternal salvation. Having set the terms of reference for investigation, this concludes part 1 of a 6-part presentation on the chronological evolution of Christ. In part 2, I will investigate and highlight the issues inherent with using Paul as a reliable witness to the validity of the scenario A Jesus. Parts 2 to 6 of this presentation will also be posted to my YouTube channel NOTORI UK, so please do visit the channel and subscribe to be notified of when they arrive.